In this video, we are going to be discussing why I think the Chicago Cubs have a good chance of making the playoffs for next year in 2024. For some context, the Cubs qualified for the playoffs in 2020, winning the NL Central, but failed to win a playoff round. They have not won a playoff round and made it past the wild card round since 2017. They have not made the playoffs in a full year since 2018. So the Cubs right now, they were approaching on being able to establish a dynasty. They made it to the NLCS in 2015. They won the World Series in 2016. They made it back to the NLCS in 2017. But 2018, they choked away the division and they lost in the wild card round. And any hopes of a potential resurrection to their dynasty in 2019 was erased when the Cubs completely collapsed by falling into a 9-game losing streak to end their season, which wound up eliminating them from the playoffs. They finished 84-78, and by no means whatsoever were they supposed to have finished that poorly. Well, 2020, the Cubs are right back in there, but then they can't do anything in the playoffs. 2021, the Cubs, in 2022, they have horrible seasons, finishing in the mid-70s for wins. 2023, they finished 83-79. And even though they had a horrible collapse, there is some optimism to be found in why the Chicago Cubs could have an amazing season next year. And in this video, I'm going to discuss why I think the Cubs can make the playoffs. So, the Cubs were not a good team in the first half. They found themselves, down early with a 22-30 record. They even found themselves, throughout the season, down with a 45-51 record around the time of the All-Star break. It was not good. But thanks to their longest winning streak since 2016, the year they won the World Series, they were able to get right back above 500, and the amazing July and August was able to overcome their pretty crappy May and June, especially May. That was a horrible month for Chicago. However, while the Cubs went into September looking really good, they collapsed. They had a 92.4% chance, so 12-13 chance to make the playoffs as of September 6th. And they lost badly. Now, you might ask, why did they lose out on this? They headed into a much needed series win over the Diamondbacks. They had to win the series, or at the very least not get destroyed. By winning only one game of the 7 they played with the Diamondbacks, they got destroyed by the Diamondbacks. They also lost out on a critical tiebreaker. They already didn't have a tiebreaker with the Miami Marlins or the Cincinnati Reds following their split series in the end of August into the beginning of September. So it was already looking very poor. The only tiebreaker they had was with the Giants, who were beginning to look increasingly irrelevant. So, obviously, when you control the tiebreakers amongst almost no one, it's very messy when the MLB literally just said that they're going to use statistical tiebreakers and not game 163s. Also, sandwiched between the two Diamondback series, the Cubs lost 2 of their 3 games against the Colorado Rockies. And that is obviously not good. They were one of the worst teams in baseball this year. The Rockies and the Broncos, everyone knows this, are embarrassments, whereas the Nuggets and Avalanche are both pretty good. So if you're in Denver, you're more into basketball and hockey and not so much into football and baseball because, it's where your sports teams are good and where they're bad. So that's just what you gotta think about if you're in Denver. So when I saw the Cubs had lost 2 or 3 against the Rockies, I knew that they were in trouble. And obviously, this began to become increasingly evident when they were 76-64, and then they were 78-72, and won in a postseason spot by virtue of, Miami Marlins and the Cubs not having a tiebreaker. So for a while, like they would enter the day tied in the standings, but Miami would always have that tiebreaker. But then things began to turn for the worse in Chicago. So, they then had to play the Pirates, and I believe they lost 2 out of 3 against the Pirates. That was concerning, losing 2 or 3 against a team as bad as the Pirates. We did eventually get our sweep of the Rockies, but then we also got swept by the Braves, even though we won the series earlier in the year. Which made me incredibly angry, especially because the Braves were a big reason why the Cubs didn't make the playoffs. Then they lost 2 out of 3 against the Nationals. I guess they wanted to get home field advantage through the playoffs, including the World Series, but still. What's also triggering is how in 2 of the games in the series, the Cubs had the lead heading into the bottom of the 8th inning, and they blew it both times. As a matter of fact, the Cubs, there was a lot of these really close games they could not win at the end of the season that cost them their season. Eventually, they played the Brewers, and even though they won, they were eliminated by virtue of a Miami Marlins win. And then they got shut out the next day and finished 83-79 on the season. So obviously, going 7-15 in your final games and blowing a greater than 90% chance to make the playoffs, and being a near lock for not only the playoffs, but the 5 seed, obviously, no bueno. You don't want to be falling into that kind of a collapse in the MLB. That being said, there are reasons to be optimistic about the Cubs heading into next year. They showed a lot of improvements, and up until their collapse, and even at the start of their collapse, they were still the second best team in the second half of the year. When they started out the second half going like 34-19. Now, obviously, when they collapsed, they were taken down to the more mediocre levels of the second half, and they had a very poor first half. But the Cubs began to have something in them. And there was some optimism. Now, the Cubs actually only missed the playoffs by 2 games. I don't like saying that because of reasons. The Diamondbacks probably would have played a bit harder against the Astros if they didn't already clinch the playoff spot. Same for the Marlins against the Pirates. They probably would have, again, fought harder. And also the Marlins would have had 85 wins had that game against the Mets meant anything, because they were almost certainly going to win if the Mets had to play in the bottom of the 9th. They probably couldn't have chalked up enough to be able to get there, but it was counted as a Mets win because the game ultimately meant nothing. So that's something you got to think about. And while technically, yes, the Cubs were 2 games out, you really got to think they were more like 3 games out, just based on semantics. They could have easily gotten there. Again, a 13-inning loss to the Diamondbacks came down to inches, several critical errors in the second half of the season. A lot of the Cubs' losses were very close. And there's reason for optimism. A lot of times when you have a team that starts off the season not doing great and ends the season off doing pretty good, a lot of times they actually can become powerhouse teams in the following year. They come up short one year, the next year they are rocking. Just look at the Baltimore Orioles. One of the worst teams in baseball for several years, from 2018 to 2021. 2022, they finished 83-79, and what do you know, by 2023, they're 101-61, and they get the number 1 seed in the American League. While they did get swept by the Texas Rangers at the end of the day in the ALDS, the fact that they even made it to the postseason just 2 years after having the worst seasons on record is astounding as it is. And the Rangers and Diamondbacks also made very quick turnarounds from where they were back in 2021 and in the land of sucking. So teams can turn around very quickly. And I think the Cubs this last year could have gotten almost 90 wins had they cashed out better, which they obviously didn't, but there's still reasons to be optimistic, because if the Cubs play like that, obviously they play like they did the second half of the year, they're going to be one of the worst teams in baseball, and they're going to finish this year with a record of about 65-97 and have one of the worst seasons in a long time. But if they improve on that and perform like what they did in July and August, and even the start of September, then the Cubs can realistically finish 89-73. Now again, I saw something saying the Cubs are probably going to finish between 83 and 88 wins. Again, is that going to be enough to make the playoffs? It depends honestly on what the benchmark is. Because this year, obviously, in the National League, 84 wins was enough to make the playoffs and 83 wasn't. Whereas in the American League, though, 89 wins was the cutoff. 89 got you in as the Blue Jays. If you were the 88-win Seattle Mariners, you were left out. Although the Twins, carrying a weak division, did get in with only 87 wins. But you got to understand that the Minnesota Twins were in a very weak AL Central. The NL Central is realistically going to be stronger than that. The Cardinals had a horrible season, but you got to think about them. You got to think about the Brewers. The Reds have to be taken into account because they finished 82-80. So you cannot count out the Reds. The Reds got eliminated at the same time the Cubs did. You have to think about all these teams that go into the equation. 83 wins is not going to be enough. And 83 wins would also only match the record from this year. Only 3 teams have ever made the playoffs with 83 or less wins. The 83-78 Cardinals from 2006, the 82-79 Mets from 1973, and the 82-80 Padres from 2005. And in all those cases, they were carrying very weak divisions. I'm pretty sure that the 84-win Marlins and Diamondbacks are the worst wildcard team ever. Though I might want to do some more research on that. But the point still stands. There is still, a lot of work to be done in all this. 88 wins, though, should be enough. Not to win the division, but to get a wild card spot of a relatively good season. I think that 88 wins is going to do the trick. But again, 88 wins for the Seattle Mariners, they didn't get it. As a matter of fact, the last 3 years, they got 88 or more wins in all of them, which only cashed out for one playoff appearance. Because in 2021, you look at the ultra-competitive American League, and 92 wins is what you need to get in. The 91 Blue Jays were kicked out, and I will say in their defense, there were only 5 seeds back then. Back then you had to be in the top 2, not the top 3 wild card teams to make it in. But even then, the Blue Jays had 91 wins, so the 90-win Seattle Mariners would have been left out under that scenario. Something, again, to take into account. So, again, am I trying to say that the Cubs are going to make it in? I don't know for sure, but they showed some improvement. I think that ultimately, in the end, they're probably going to finish about 86-76 with their record. The question is that going to be enough to make the playoffs? And you got to think. You got to think how the Braves are probably going to win the NL East, and the Phillies are going to do really good and be a wild card team. You got to think how the Marlins were able to actually have a successful season. They've never been consistent. But you got to worry, can the Miami Marlins actually be a consistent team? You got to think, for some of these other teams, you got to think, either the Brewers or the Cardinals are most likely winning the division. So the Cubs are very likely to win the NL Central. You got to also put the Reds into the equation. The San Diego Padres, they had 82 wins this season. So, they haven't gone away completely. And you know how the Cubs were in a position where statistically they should have been one of the best teams in baseball, but they couldn't cash out for wins? Yeah, the Padres were more extreme than the Cubs in that regard. So, Padres, you gotta worry about the Padres. Also, the San Francisco Giants, again, they can make a comeback on the season. While no one's taking the Diamondbacks seriously because of how lucky they were to even be in the playoffs. I mean, like, they might be one of the longest odds to make it back to the World Series. And people might say it's luck, but you can't count them out of it. I mean, like, they did make it to a World Series. And all of this is under the umbrella that the Dodgers win the division. So all these other teams, like, really, they're going to be in a wild card. It's going to get competitive in there. You also have to think about how a team like the Mets could maybe actually magically come back and steal the Cubs spot. There is so much that can go wrong for the Cubs, but ultimately 2023 was one of the most heartbreaking collapses in Cubs history. Right up there with like the 2007 New York Mets, when they were a lock to make the playoffs and then they lost 12 out of their last 17. That's an example of a brutal collapse. This, obviously, the other collapses in 2019 Cubs wasn't as heartbreaking because that wasn't the case of where they were locked to make the playoffs and then they choked away on the season. That was more so a case of where they were. That was more so a case of where the Cubs were barely at a postseason spot and then lost 9 consecutive games to kick them out. But they were out of it by a long shot. They were like 5 games out. So that's not a fair comparison. Like the most heartbreaking collapses are the ones where a team gets so close and ultimately comes up just short. But again, I think that the Cubs can make the playoffs next year, probably as a 6th seed. And yeah, the future for Chicago baseball and the Cubs looks somewhat bright. There's a somewhat bright future. And of course, maybe the Cubs do amazing and they actually get like 100 wins. They could also do horrible and get like 60. But I think 86 is a fair place to put the Cubs right now.